Welcome to ING's Think Aloud, where we try to make sense of the world in the most unbanky way we can. In today's episode,
It is now up to us to put before the nations of the world what has to be done. We don't need to emphasize to them or to you that the longer we leave it and not doing things but going on talking about the problems, the worse it's going to get. And in the end, unless we do something, it becomes insoluble.
it was supposed to be the year of climate action. When Sir David Attenborough spoke in February to launch the next United Nations Climate Change Conference, the sense of hope was palpable. But the outbreak of Covid-19 and economic destruction left in its wake has created an even more pressing emergency, and environmentalists fear that climate action could become another casualty of the crisis. I'm Rebecca Byrne, and today I'm joined by Mark Cliffe, Global Head of ING's New Horizons Hub, to discuss what the pandemic could mean for the planet. Mark, people are understandably worried right now about their health and about their jobs, and for a lot of people, saving the planet is a far less pressing problem. So if climate advocates want to push forward their agenda, what are they going to have to do?
I think the key is to link it to people's worries about jobs. There are plenty of jobs to be had in greening the economy. So I think we need to move towards a popular narrative that takes us away from the notion of a green recovery to a broader, sustainable recovery, which has people's welfare at its heart. It's not for nothing that people come first in the so-called triple bottom line of people, planet, and profits. And this also means mobilizing civil society as well as business. And of course, while many people are trying to put food on the table, we shouldn't underestimate how far the pandemic has affected social attitudes. We're paying a lot more attention to scientists. We're much more aware of nature and of our mutual interdependence. And we've become more neighborly, and we're beginning to make more sacrifices. And I think these are precisely the kind of qualities that should help mobilize civil society to act on climate change.
But some governments have been pushing back against the idea of making climate action a priority. And there's also less incentive to invest in green policies given the drop in oil prices and the fact that pollution has gone down anyway due to the lockdowns. Are you concerned that the pandemic has removed the sense of urgency to protect the environment?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's definitely a feeling that brown jobs are better than no jobs, as it were. And I think there's certainly a worry that lower fossil energy prices will undermine the cost advantage of renewable energy. Another problem, indeed, is that lower prices and profits will squeeze the money available for investing in renewables. But that said, I think renewable energy is getting progressively cheaper, and the industry knows that they have to keep moving in that direction. And I would also say there's a golden opportunity for the governments in low energy prices at the moment to raise the prices of carbon emissions through taxes, or in the case of Europe, we have tradable emissions permits. So, that's a great opportunity. And I think also social attitudes again play a part. The fact that pollution has gone down during the pandemic has given us a sense of what life could be like with cleaner energy. So many of us don't really want to go back to where we were before.
Right. One consequence of the pandemic is that it's fueled talk of deglobalization. The onus has very much been on finding national solutions. And at the same time, it's exacerbated tensions between the US and China. Does this threaten the prospects for global cooperation on issues like climate change?
Yes, this is certainly a threat. Securing global cooperation was already a problem before the pandemic began. And the pandemic certainly hasn't helped. We've seen some countries backtracking or postponing carbon mitigation policies, such as vehicle emission standards. And the blame game over the pandemic between the US and China, who, after all, are the two largest carbon emitting countries, is particularly worrying. Without them on board, it's going to be harder to make progress in the next phase of climate talks. But I'd say there are two sources of hope here. One is that there is still a global commitment to climate action, and quite a few countries, notably in Europe, have really reaffirmed their commitment, and they may be able to broker a deal next year when the COP26 talks take place. The other factor is that some nationalist governments who are typically climate change skeptics have lost popularity over their handling of the pandemic.
Well, one of those climate change skeptics is, of course, Donald Trump. And there's a presidential election in November. How significant is that going to be? Because clearly President Trump and Joe Biden have very different views on the environment. But that doesn't mean that if Biden wins, it's all plain sailing for the climate advocates, right?
Yes, this is very important. In fact, this election is probably the biggest issue for climate change in the next few months. Biden, as the Democrat challenger, has the most progressive climate platform that we've ever seen in the US, and he's pledged to have the US rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and to commit the US to net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050. But you're right, even if he beats President Trump in November, it's not exactly going to be plain sailing. He's going to need to secure the support of Congress. There's bound to be pushback from consumers and businesses who fear losing out because of climate change policies. And Biden would have to find a way of doing a deal with China. But that said, I think there's no doubt whatsoever, given the contrast between his position and that of President Trump, that a Biden victory would be a game changer for climate change.
Right. Despite the fact that President Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, there has been growing support in Republican circles for a carbon tax, which is redistributed among households. This sounds like a very good way to get a lot of people interested in cutting emissions. Tell us about that.
Yes, indeed. I think this is a very smart idea. Some Republicans have bought into this idea of compensating households for higher taxes on emissions with a so-called carbon dividend, which will be paid to all households. So there's one plan, which is called the Baker-Schultz plan, which would result in a family of four getting something like $2,000 a year. And that's in return for a tax per carbon emissions ton of just over $40. The effect of this, which has been analysed by the US Treasury, is that poorer households would gain more than they lose from this plan. And this is a neat way of neutralising one of the biggest objections to the carbon tax, which is essentially that it's regressive, that it hurts the poorer households more than the rich. And some Republicans like it because it relies on using market mechanisms rather than regulations to reduce emissions.
Right. In Europe, there's been some positive news for climate advocates during the pandemic. Germany, for example, has doubled its incentives for electric cars, and the UK has been investing in electric car charging. But you say that higher taxes, aside from a carbon tax, may be part of the solution as well. Governments would have to tread pretty carefully here, though, wouldn't they?
Yes, they certainly would. I mean, President Macron in France learned the hard way when he decided to increase taxes on fuel. If you recall, this sparked massive protests from the so-called Gilets jaunes movement, the Yellow Vest movement. That movement was particularly upset about what Macron had done because it obviously affected less well-off particularly hard, and also drivers in the rural areas. So that's why governments in Europe really need to have a plan to address the concerns of those who might lose out from climate policies, whether it's through higher taxes or job losses in the so-called brown industries.
Mark, policymakers have provided a lot of emergency funding and loans to businesses during the pandemic, but they've been so far quite reluctant to attach any environmental conditions to that help. Do you think they will in the future?
I think so. Obviously, in their rush to support the economy and keep businesses afloat, they've been so far relatively reluctant to add so-called green strings to their support measures. But let's be clear: the pandemic is far from over, and some of the brown businesses are going to need more support. So there's time for governments to revisit this. And I think in particular with the big build-up of debt that we're going to see, the governments may have the opportunity for targeted taxes that would enable them to claw back some of the support that they've been providing. The other thing is that they may well be able to shift the burden of taxes away from labour to taxes on carbon emissions and resource use in general.
In your report this week, you say that the outcome to all of this will likely be a binary one. Either we go back to how things were before, or there's a radical shift in policy and in the tax system. How do you see things playing out?
Well, I think we've essentially got a window of opportunity here. I mean, this is partly an economic one. The fact that we have low energy prices at the moment gives them scope for stepping up on carbon taxes and carbon pricing. We're also in a situation where low interest rates are likely to stick around for a long time, and that helps the funding of new investments in greening the economy. And also, governments have got quite a lot of leverage over companies that they're supporting with financial support. But I think there's also a window of opportunity in a sort of social and a political sense. There's clearly more of an appetite for listening to science and to policy advocates. And I think there's really also a mandate for radical action on the part of governments. But the reason why I think it's sort of pretty binary at the moment is that we do need to see the popular mood translating into the necessary political changes. And again, this is where the US elections are so consequential this year. That's going to be a key test of whether climate action will be a casualty or a survivor of the pandemic.
Okay, Mark Cliffe, Global Head of ING's New Horizons Hub. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
This podcast has been prepared by ING solely for information purposes, irrespective of a particular user's means, financial situation, or investment objective. The information does not constitute investment recommendation, and nor is it investment, legal, or tax advice, or an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instrument. Read more at think.ing.com/content-disclaimer.